there's a new church movement that I believe has the potential to change the landscape of the American church. And it's a movement that, even if it doesn't become the predominant church movement, I think it's one that we need to pay attention to, because I believe there's a lot that churches of all kinds, Christians of all kinds, from small to giga churches, from single site churches to multi site mega churches, we can all learn a lot from this church movement. And I think there's some good questions that are coming up from it. But the movement I want to talk about today is the micro church movement. And one great example of the micro church movement is what is happening in Nebraska right now. And the Roy's Report talked about that this week on a news report that they put out. I'm going to go ahead and pull it up. But the news report said, micro church model is reaching rural Nebraska. Now, if you're familiar, a lot of Nebraska is very rural, very spread out, and it's hard to even have churches there because people are so spread out. When you have churches, they're still really small. They might be 25, 30, 40 people, okay? It's not church like you're going to experience in the Southeast, okay, or in the Bible Belt. So in this part of rural Nebraska, there's an Assemblies of God pastor who has started a micro church planting network. And Julie Roy's The Roy's Report, they highlight this, and I love it. There's always pastors who say the Roy's Report seems like they're always trying to tear down the church. They're just against the church. And then you look at stories like this and you realize actually they're not. They celebrate large churches paying off medical debt for people in their communities. They celebrate things like this. So anyway, I saw this story come through this week. I thought it was really cool because this micro church movement is a good example of what I'm hearing about all over the country. And people may not be calling them micro churches. Sometimes they're calling them house churches. There's a lot of different things they could call them. But I am seeing a hunger and a desire for these smaller micro churches, but also sometimes it's not for the size of the church, it's for what those churches offer that is different from kind of what we come to know with the mega church model. And even if you're not in a mega church, a lot of us are in churches that are using mega church growth systems. So a lot of your smaller churches, 200, 300 member churches, can feel more mega churchy, if that's a word today, than maybe they did in the past. So I wanted to look at this together about this micro church model and then just make some notes about some things that I think this can teach us and inform us, and questions it can give us to ask in the current landscape of the American church. Okay, so it starts out by talking about the vast expense of Holt County, ranchland in Nebraska's outback. Cows outnumber people 10 to 1. So that just gives you a good idea of where they're at. Okay, so in the southeastern corner of Ewing, this pastor who started to do this, Mark Hoffman, okay, there's a population of 373 people in Ewing, and he's been leading a church for years now that has an average Sunday attendance of 32 people. Okay, so he's been leading this church, which is not considered a micro church, but it's got 32 people in it. Now, you may be saying, Jeff, that's really small, but did you know that the average church in the United States is under 75 people? Okay, so that means even though that over half of American Christians are going to the top 9% of largest churches, if you're not going to a church that's 400 and above, then that means that there's a whole lot of churches bringing that average down. So if the average with all those big ones is 75, the reality is there's a whole lot, not just in Nebraska, there's a whole lot of churches with average attendances of 30 to 50 people. I've got some pastor friends right now who are pastoring churches, 50 or so people. Okay. So that's much more of a norm than we would like to think about. Okay. So you got people who are in kind of the top, over half of us in the top 9% of churches, and then a whole nother group of Christians that are in these smaller churches. Okay. But micro churches are going to be even smaller than that. Okay. So they've lived in this small area for so long. This guy's church is aging. So 32 people, but most of them are older. And after he did kind of his ministry work, the concept of micro churches as a church planting model kind of caught his eye, and he started looking at how he could use that micro church model in Nebraska. He says this, I love this: a micro church is the simplest form of church. You strip away the overhead. Okay. How often are our churches just so complex? How often are our churches, filled with so many different things, so many different programs and light shows and entertainment and this, that, and the other. And we got to be at the church 4 or 5 times, a week plus small group and all this stuff. It's really easy for church to get complex. One of the things I think is drawing people to things like this micro church model is just what he said there. It's so dang simple. So he says a micro church is one of the simplest forms of church, and you strip away all the overhead. If you're not familiar, the religion business is actually releasing a documentary this Easter about the misappropriation of funds and lack of transparency in churches. And one of the reasons why they're doing this is not just to pick on churches. One of the premises they present is that the church, the global church, could solve the most pressing problems in the world right now that governments can't even solve if we just appropriated our money differently. And they even talk about how billions are stolen from the church every year. But more than that, the majority of the money that comes into churches is used on overhead. It's used on buildings. It's used on salaries. Now, buildings and salaries, guys, they are not bad. But what could happen? What could happen if we spent a little less money on salaries, a little less money on buildings, a little less money on programs, and more money on the felt needs of our community, on solving problems in the world, right? And I think about how Jesus did ministry, right? I think about how Jesus taught his disciples to do ministry. Everywhere they went, they would heal people, they would feed people, okay? They weren't just doing parlor tricks, but what they were doing was they were challenging people theologically. They were bringing conviction, okay? They were teaching about the kingdom of God. They were discipling people, but they were also meeting people's needs, okay? And all throughout, if you look at early church history, one of the ways the church was best known is that, hey, when there was struggle, when people had a need, the church was going to run in when everybody else ran out. You fast forward into medieval history, and there are stories about, during times like the plague, where everybody else would run away and the Christians would run in. The church has historically had this reputation for making change in the world and meeting people's needs even when governments can't. So what would happen if we shifted our model, which today has become predominantly about our own overhead, our own salaries, our own systems, our own programs, and begin to meet the needs of people around us, okay? We began to really do things in our community that were transformative. I think that's a good question to ask. I don't know that I know all the answers of how to get there. But I think that the more we ask these questions and have these conversations, the better off we get as a church. But let's look at what a micro church is. It says a micro church, he explains, ranges in size from 3 to 20. 3 to 20. So as little as 3 people would be a micro church. If you go over 20, you're not considered a micro church anymore. You're just considered kind of a small church. So, and this is understatement of the year, but because they range from 3 to 20, they're more intimate than a traditional church, okay? Often the gathering has no set location. The most common sites are living rooms. Now, I just want to ask you, what does that sound like? What does that remind you of? Okay, that there's 3 to 20 people in these micro churches. They don't have a set gathering location. They might meet in one place this week and another place this week. And the most common place that they're going to meet are living rooms. Although, as you're going to see, they met in bars, they met in restaurants, they met in other places. Okay. But what does that sound like? To me, that sounds like the early first century church. When Paul described the church, it was gatherings a lot of times of 3 to 20 or 3 to 30 people. It was just the amount of people that could meet in a house, because almost every church in the New Testament, every time Paul talked about the church, they met in houses. And there may be tons of Christians across a city, like in Corinth. There were a lot of Christians. And in Ephesus, there were a lot of Christians and a lot of these churches, yet they met in each other's houses. Not only that, they all had a role to play, right? Multiple people would teach, multiple people would prophesy, multiple people would sing songs, right? They would share communion together. And communion back then, it wasn't a little cup of grape juice and a cracker. They called communion the love feast. Why? Because they gathered together in a home and literally celebrated a feast together. And that was their act of communion. Okay. So I think these micro churches, there's so much of it that brings back almost this flair. And I don't know that this has to only happen in small churches. Okay. I don't think size is necessarily what we're talking about here, or the greatest thing that we can take away from here. In our modern day church, think about how we move so much to just a few people do everything, and the rest of us just watch a few people do everything. And Now you have one set location and it's nice, and there's stage design, which there's nothing wrong with. There's hazers and lights, there's nothing wrong with them. But what does that do? Puts us in a little bit more of an entertainment mindset. It puts us in a, hey, I'm coming here so you can feed me mindset, versus the early church and micro churches like this. Your location is not the church because it may change. Okay. More than that, everybody has to be involved, because if everybody doesn't do something, then church won't happen. And beyond that, it's not about one person who's teaching or one person who's in charge. You read this article, you're never going to hear anything. You're not going to notice a single thing, or at least I didn't, about who's in charge of these churches or the pastors of these churches. And when you go back and you look at the early church, you never hear Paul talking about the pastor of a church or the leader of a church. He's telling them multiple people taught, multiple people prophesied, multiple people did all that. And then your elders were overseeing multiple churches in a city. I don't want to get deep into that today, but that was what the early church looked like. So because they were all involved, they saw church differently, and they grew, I think, a lot faster. Discipleship was different. Beyond that, because the location and the house they met in could change, they never really thought about church as something we go to as much as church was something that we are. In American Christianity, we tend to think about church as a place we go to, something we do. In the first century, that would have been really foreign. They would have thought about church as who they are, okay, and how they operate in the world. And then because church happened so often in the first century in houses, the same thing that happens with these micro churches, it becomes more intimate. It becomes more about relational ministry together rather than programs. So anyway, that's what it reminds me of. And I think asking the question, regardless of how big your church is, even for giga churches and mega churches, how can we bring back some of the important elements from the early church and from small and micro churches? How can we bring back some of those elements and really get them involved in the church? And I know for a lot of people, the simple answer is small groups. Yet in most small groups, you still have one person who's teaching a curriculum, and everybody might chime in, but it's not the same thing. It's not, hey, multiple people are bringing a word, multiple people are prophesying about that word, people are singing. Everybody is not involved that way. And I think there's something that we miss from it. But anyway, I think this is a really cool look at churches that are rediscovering some of the power of the early church. Okay. And I love this. He says, like a Bible group, like a home Bible group or a small group, like we just talked about, it is an extended spiritual family and provides more personal, close-knit community. However, Hoffman's careful to note that microchurch isn't the same thing. It goes much deeper, much more intimate. There's a lot more discipleship. There's a lot more accountability than you're going to find in a small group, okay? And he says, rather than actively just being a Bible study group, a microchurch actively engages in living out the gospel and establishing new communities of believers. So every one of these microchurches, these house churches even, are planting other micro and house churches. They're trying to, hey, we're going to do this, and we're going to kind of split off, and we're going to start another group and another church somewhere else. So their goal isn't just to get really big or to have a lot of sites. It's to expand and disciple a lot of people, okay? While it often meets in homes, it's a mission-driven community focused on discipleship, evangelism, and multiplication. Okay, I love that, because what we've distilled discipleship to, we've oversimplified discipleship and made it something that it never was in the first century church. When the apostles heard, and we're going to do a whole podcast on this soon, but when the 12 disciples heard Jesus say, go and make disciples of all nations, they did not hear what we hear about discipleship. We have made in the American church, discipleship has become a lot about programs and teaching and Bible studies, and it's become about knowledge. Okay, knowledge. Discipleship was not primarily about knowledge. Okay, knowledge was a big part of it, but discipleship was primarily about relationship and experience as you learned knowledge and put knowledge into practice. Okay, so discipleship was a part of the fabric of Jewish society. So when they heard about it, again, it went much, much deeper. This looks a lot like what's happening in these micro churches. It looks a lot more like discipleship than just the teaching kind of programming look that we give to it today. Okay. A micro church stands on three minimal essentials. I love that focus on, hey, let's be simple. Let's be minimal. Let's limit the overhead. Okay. He says it begins with worship. which encompasses a lot more than singing songs. It's Bible study, it's the discipleship process, it's life together. It also focuses on reproducing disciples that can help the church emerge in other unique contexts. So again, we're discipling you to help go be a part of leading and starting churches in these other spots. So there's no consumer Christianity because you're expected to be a part of leading. Okay. Just like the early church, everybody in the early church played a part, everybody had a role. There weren't just leaders that we looked to do this for us. Okay. And he said, micro churches composed of farmers or ranchers, for example, they might not meet at a house, they might meet in like co-ops. He talks about another one where he had one that met in a bar at one point, right? So there's all of these places where they can meet. And look, if you lose your location, you just find another one. Okay. Well, my gosh, we lost our location. We can't meet somewhere tomorrow. Okay. Well, whose house are we meeting at next time? It gives you so many more opportunities. Right here, the micro church Hoffman launched in a restaurant bar 4 years ago. So this was in a restaurant, was made up of people in their 30s, married couples. And I love this part. A single woman with deep questions as she was deconstructing her faith. Okay. Watch what happened. There was a safe place for her to meet in a small group, for her to meet in this small micro church at a restaurant with other people her age. They were okay with her deconstructing her faith. They were okay with her asking deep questions. And ultimately, amid finding answers, not just asking the questions, but finding answers, she trusted Christ in the small setting and came into a deeper walk with him. And I think that's what the early church looked like. You could ask questions. No one was scared your questions were going to lead you away from faith. They were just going to walk with you in it and trust the Holy Spirit was going to draw you to faith. Okay. He talks about in this article, a diesel mechanic got saved in Hoffman's micro church, and the Lord delivered him from drug addiction, changed his life immediately. Okay. And now, as a new believer, he's mentoring a new believer in his garage micro church that's launching its own group for people who are suffering from addiction. So this guy was healed in this church. He was discipled in this church. And now he is leading another church in the garage that he's a mechanic at. Okay. It says miracles like that happen all the time. People are being set free. And by nature, these groups tend to multiply. So anyway, I wanted to share that because I thought it was so cool. Whether a micro church is for you or not, whether a house church is for you or not, I think there's definitely some things that stand out. There are some parts of the early church that I think we're missing as we put an overemphasis on programs and entertainment and systems, and all of those things are good. I don't think that big churches or mega churches need to go away. I don't think that house churches and micro churches are the only churches we're going to see in the future, although I do see a movement of growth in those, that people are hungry for those. So I think over the next 10, 20 years, we are going to see a lot more micro and house churches. But I don't think the mega church and the giga church is necessarily going anywhere. The key, though, I believe that the healthiest churches, the churches that are going to make the biggest difference in the world, are going to be the churches that, regardless of their size, start asking, how can we give everybody a voice? How can we get everybody involved in the ministry? And how can we lower overhead? How can we simplify? How can we be the church? And the churches that really ask, how can we bring back some of the things that we've lost from the early church in our modern day church culture? Churches that ask those questions and really trace the answers to those questions, they follow them all the way to the end. I think those are going to be the churches that we see really explode, have the best reputations, and make the biggest difference over the next few decades. So what do you think? What do you think we can learn most? What are the best lessons we can learn from these micro churches that are popping up, not just in Nebraska, but all over the world? What questions does this pose that we need to ask in our churches? And I would love to hear from you in the chat, in the comments. What do you think the future of the church is? Okay, because there's a lot of movement in the church right now. And regardless of whether we agree on what the future of the church is, I would love to hear your input, because I think one of the things that many of us can agree on, maybe not all of us, but the church is changing. The church is going through a season in America of changing, and some of it is tough, some of it's hard, but I think ultimately this season of changing is good. So let us know what you think in the comments. Let's talk about it, and let's all be an active part of what God is doing as he's reforming his church right before our eyes.